Claire Evans never imagined her life would start to feel like someone else's story, one she didn't remember choosing. At 51, living in a quiet suburb of Portland. Her days were predictable. Morning coffee alone, work calls, an empty house by evening. Her husband Mark was successful but distant, always busy, always tired. His affection reduced to brief nods and distracted smiles. They'd been married for 26 years, but somewhere along the way, the closeness had quietly disappeared. What once felt like love had turned into polite companionship. They didn't fight, but they didn't connect either. Claire couldn't remember the last time they'd laughed together, the kind of laugh that makes you forget the years in between. She'd tried everything: weekend trips, dinners out, soft conversations. But Mark had a way of shutting down emotions with a few cold words. "I'm just stressed, Claire. Stop overthinking." One evening, as she sat alone on their porch, watching the rain streak the windows, she realized she couldn't do it anymore. Not the silence, not the loneliness. Her friend Megan, a retired teacher, had noticed the sadness in her eyes and suggested therapy. "Sometimes," Megan said, "you just need someone who listens." That's how Claire found herself sitting in a small, warmly lit office 2 weeks later. The plaque on the door read Dr. James Porter, licensed therapist. From the moment she stepped in, something about the room felt safe. There was a quiet hum from a diffuser, the smell of cedar and peppermint in the air, and books neatly stacked on the shelves behind the desk. Then she met James' mid-40s, kind eyes, calm voice. His presence was steady, the kind that instantly made people breathe easier. "Take your time," said softly as she settled onto the couch. "We'll start wherever you feel comfortable." It took only minutes for Claire to begin talking about her marriage, her exhaustion, the sense of fading from her own life. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding back until the words started tumbling out. James listened without interrupting. He didn't rush her. He didn't judge. When she paused, he said quietly, "You've been taking care of everyone but yourself, haven't you?" Her throat tightened. No one had ever noticed that before, not even Mark, for the first time in years. Claire felt truly seen. Over the next few weeks, their sessions became something she looked forward to. She would drive across town, watching the city lights blur through her windshield, feeling both nervous and excited. Therapy had started as a place to release her pain, but slowly it became a space where she could feel again. James had a way of asking questions that went deeper than expected. "When did you stop believing you deserved joy?" he asked one day. Claire looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "Maybe when Mark stopped looking at me the same way." James nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You tied your happiness to someone who forgot to hold it." His words lingered long after the session ended. She repeated them in her head while folding laundry, while driving home, while lying awake in bed beside Mark's sleeping figure. The simplicity of his voice, the truth in it, it stirred something deep inside her. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Claire entered the office looking defeated. Work had been stressful, and Mark had canceled dinner plans again, saying he was too exhausted. She tried to talk about it during her session, but halfway through, her voice cracked. Tears spilled down her face before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Embarrassed, James leaned forward, his tone gentle. "Don't apologize for feeling." He passed her a tissue and waited quietly. Something about the silence felt comforting, the kind that holds space, not judgment. When she finally looked up, their eyes met, and she saw a kind of empathy that almost broke her. He said softly, "You've carried too much for too long. It's okay to let someone help." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit deep. For years, she had been the helper, the fixer, the calm one. No one had ever offered her comfort like that, not sincerely. The session ended with a small, reassuring smile from him. But as she stood to leave, James reached out briefly and rested his hand on her shoulder. It was a professional gesture, steady, reassuring, yet something about it made her heart race. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was the shock of being noticed with care. That night, she thought about that moment longer than she should have. She felt foolish for it, but it was the first time in years that anything had made her feel alive. Over the next few sessions, Claire found herself opening up more easily. She talked about her youth, her dreams, her love of painting, things she hadn't mentioned to anyone in years. James listened intently, sometimes smiling when she spoke about her old passions. "You should paint again," he said once. "There's still color in you, Claire. You just stopped seeing it." The words caught her off guard. No one had ever spoken to her like that, gently. But with conviction, she started painting again the following weekend, setting up her old easel by the window. The brush in her hand felt like rediscovering a piece of herself she'd forgotten. She wanted to tell James to show him that she was changing, and she did, the next time she saw him. His reaction was genuine. "I'm proud of you," he said, smiling. "That's a big step." The warmth in his voice stayed with her all day. But slowly Claire began to feel a shift, something quiet but undeniable. She found herself thinking about James outside of their sessions, wondering what his life was like beyond those walls. She noticed the small things, the way his brow furrowed when he was deep in thought, the way he adjusted his glasses when she said something that moved him. It was harmless, she told herself. Just admiration for someone kind. Yet each session felt heavier, filled with things unspoken. One afternoon, near the end of a long session, Claire laughed softly after sharing a story about her teenage son. James smiled, but then his expression softened. "You have such warmth when you talk about your family," he said quietly. "You should receive that same warmth back." The comment lingered between them, fragile and loaded. Neither spoke for a few seconds. Then she gathered her things and said, almost in a whisper, "Thank you for listening." He nodded. Always. When she left that day, the air outside felt different, colder, sharper. Claire couldn't explain it, but she sensed a boundary had been crossed. Not in words, not in actions, but in feeling. That night, she avoided looking at Mark as they ate dinner. When he asked how therapy was going, she said it was fine. But her heart was beating faster than usual. The truth scared her. She knew she was getting too close emotionally. Not physically, but part of her didn't want to stop. It was the first time in years that someone had made her feel valued, understood, and alive. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering the quiet tone of James's voice, the way he said you deserve warmth. And in the stillness of that night, she wondered whether she had crossed a line, or if she had simply found a version of herself she thought was gone. The next morning, she looked at herself in the mirror. There was a faint glow in her reflection, something between guilt and rediscovery. She didn't know where this path was leading, but she knew one thing for sure. Something inside her had changed forever. The following week, Claire sat in her car outside James's office longer than usual. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, but her mind was somewhere else. She wasn't nervous, not exactly, but she could feel something had shifted inside her. Something quiet, yet undeniable. She told herself it was only admiration, gratitude, even. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole truth. When she finally walked in, James greeted her with his usual calm smile. "Claire," he said warmly, "it's good to see you." It was a simple greeting, but the way he said it with genuine softness made her feel seen in a way her husband hadn't in years. As she sat down, the session began, like always. She talked about her week, how she'd tried cooking a new recipe that Mark barely touched, how their conversations had grown thinner, quieter. James listened, leaning slightly forward, his tone thoughtful. "You're craving connection," he said, "but you're trying to find it in a place that's already empty." The truth of his words made her chest ache. "I just wish he'd notice me again," she whispered. James paused, his eyes steady on hers. "Sometimes people stop seeing us not because we've changed, but because they stopped looking." "That's not your fault." Claire looked down, her throat tight. "It still hurts." "I know," he said softly, "but you're learning to see yourself again, and that's powerful." His words washed over her like comfort and guilt all at once. She nodded, brushing away a tear that escaped before she could stop it. When she looked up, he handed her a tissue. their hands brushing for the briefest second. The touch was small, fleeting, but it made her heart skip. She quickly pulled her hand back, embarrassed. James pretended not to notice, but something unreadable passed through his eyes. The rest of the session passed quietly. When it ended, James said in his calm voice, "You've come a long way, Claire. Don't underestimate that." She smiled weakly and left, but the moment lingered long after she got home. She replayed the look in his eyes, the tone in his voice. She told herself it was just therapy. That warmth was part of the job. But her heart refused to listen. Days passed. Her marriage felt emptier than ever. Mark was working late almost every night, and even when he was home, he was distant, absorbed in his phone or the news. One evening, she tried to talk about a movie she'd watched, but he mumbled, "Not now, Claire. I'm tired." Something inside her sank. She realized she didn't expect warmth from him anymore. She'd stopped hoping for it. The next time she saw James, she tried to act casual. But as soon as their eyes met, she felt the same rush of emotion. He noticed something different about her, too. "You seem heavy today," he said gently. She gave a weak smile. "It's been hard. I feel invisible at home. Tell me about it." So she did. She talked about years of silence, of trying and being met with indifference. James listened quietly, then said, "You deserve someone who listens, Claire. Not just here, everywhere." She looked at him, her voice trembling. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," he admitted. "But it's possible." The air between them grew still. There was an understanding, quiet, dangerous, unspoken dot. The next few sessions continued like that, filled with words that healed and glances that said, but neither dared to speak. James was professional, but the tone of their conversations had softened, become more personal. He'd ask how she slept, whether she was painting again, whether she'd eaten breakfast that day. Small things, but they meant everything to her. Claire began dressing differently before her appointments. She'd fix her hair carefully, put on soft perfume, and tell herself it was for confidence. But she knew she wanted to look her best for him. One afternoon, the session took an unexpected turn. Claire was talking about how she'd found one of Mark's old love letters from when they were dating. Reading it made her cry. Realizing how much had changed, she whispered, "I don't even recognize us anymore." James leaned forward, his tone low. "Do you recognize yourself?" She shook her head. "Not lately." He stood, walked to the shelf, and handed her a notebook. "Start writing again. Not for anyone else, for you. Put down everything you've lost and everything you still want." Claire smiled faintly, touched by his thoughtfulness. "You always know what to say." "Maybe because I listen," he replied softly. For a moment, silence filled the room. It wasn't awkward. It was heavy with something unnamed. She could hear the faint ticking of the clock. When their eyes met, there was a flicker of emotion neither could disguise. She stood to leave, clutching the notebook to her chest. "Thank you, James." He hesitated before responding. "Take care of yourself, Claire." His voice was quiet but carried something warmer than usual, almost personal. That night, Claire wrote in the notebook for hours. She wrote about the woman she used to be, about laughter in small kitchens, about the love she once believed would last forever. But she also wrote about James, about his calm eyes, his patience, his kindness. She wrote things she knew she'd never say aloud. Over the next few weeks, her emotions grew tangled. She started checking the clock eagerly on therapy days, counting hours until she'd see him again. It scared her, but she couldn't help it. He had become her comfort, her escape, her quiet happiness. During one session, she tried to pull back emotionally. She spoke less, avoided eye contact. But James noticed. "You're holding back," he said softly. I think I've depended too much on this," she admitted. "On you." He was silent for a long time. "It's okay to find comfort here," he said eventually. "But remember, healing also means learning to trust yourself again." Claire smiled faintly, but her eyes glistened. "You make it sound easy." He smiled back, a sad, understanding smile. "It never is." There was warmth in his expression that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't the look of a therapist anymore. It was human, emotional, fragile. When the session ended, she stood by the door, hesitating. She wanted to say something, anything, but words failed her. James looked at her, waiting, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without these talks," he replied gently. "You're stronger than you think, Claire. You'd find your way." But when she walked out, she knew it wasn't true. She was already too attached to the words, the silence, the safety of that room, as weeks passed. Her feelings grew harder to hide. Every conversation felt charged with something deeper. She knew it was dangerous, wrong even. But her heart refused to listen. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon. Claire arrived earlier than usual, her heart restless. The air outside was heavy with summer heat, and inside, the office felt unusually still. She sat down, and before she could speak, James said softly, "You seem distant today." She sighed. "Maybe I am. I've been thinking a lot about what?" She hesitated. "About where all this is going?" He leaned back, his face thoughtful. "You mean therapy?" She nodded slowly. "And beyond that?" There was silence, long and loaded. Neither moved. Then, very gently, James said, "Sometimes when we're vulnerable, we confuse understanding with affection. It's natural." Claire looked down, her voice trembling. "What if it's more than that?" The question hung in the air, unspoken and irreversible. James didn't answer right away. His expression softened, but his eyes revealed something she hadn't seen before: conflict. "Claire," he said quietly, "feelings are complicated, but healing means facing them honestly." The session ended quietly. No goodbyes, just a lingering glance that said too much. As Claire walked to her car, the world felt both brighter and heavier. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing: she couldn't pretend anymore. Something inside her heart had already crossed a line, even if her actions hadn't. The weekend after that tense session, Claire couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said and what she hadn't. Her words kept echoing in her head. What if it's more than that? She had never planned to say it. It just slipped out, pulled from a part of her heart she hadn't controlled in years. For 2 days, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw James's face, serious, but also filled with something he didn't say. She thought about how carefully he'd listened to her for months, how he'd helped her find herself again. But she also thought about Mark, her husband, who had once been her best friend. The guilt twisted inside her like a knot dot by Monday morning. She had decided she needed to end therapy, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. The emotions had gone too far. She couldn't sit in that room anymore pretending it was just therapy when it clearly WASN single quotes T. When she walked into the office that afternoon, she already felt tears pressing behind her eyes. James looked up from his desk, surprised. "Claire," he said softly, "you look upset. Is everything all right?" She sat down, clutching her hands together. "I think I need to stop coming," she said quickly, before her courage faded. James blinked. "Why?" She hesitated, then said in a trembling voice, "Because I crossed a line. I started feeling things I shouldn't. You've been kind, patient, and good to me, and I let it turn into something else." For a long moment, James didn't speak. His eyes lowered to the floor. When he finally looked up, his voice was quiet. "Claire, you're not the first person to feel that. When people are deeply understood, it can stir emotions that feel confusing. But I want you to know, you didn't do anything wrong by being human." His words were gentle, but they only made the ache worse. "It feels wrong," she said softly, "because I started to depend on this. On you." James nodded slowly. "Therapy can open doors we didn't expect. What matters is that you see it clearly, and you are." There was silence for a long moment. The hum of the clock filled the space between them. Claire felt a single tear slip down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You don't need to be," he replied. "You came here to find yourself, and maybe that's what this feeling is. A reminder that you're still capable of emotion." "You're alive again." She looked up, eyes glistening. Alive, but lost. He gave a faint smile. That's how most beginnings feel. She wanted to say something. Anything, but her throat was tight. Finally, she stood up, trying to steady her voice. "Thank you for everything. You've helped me more than you'll ever know." He rose too, his hands in his pockets. "You did the work, Claire. Don't forget that." She reached out her hand. It was a simple gesture of goodbye, but when he took it, there was a pause, brief but heavy. Their eyes met, and in that silence, there was every emotion they couldn't express: gratitude, longing, and restraint. Then he gently let go. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly. Claire nodded, her voice barely audible. "You too." She left the office with her heart pounding. The moment she stepped outside, the cool air hit her face like a rush of clarity. She didn't look back. She knew if she did, she wouldn't have the strength to walk away. That night, she sat on her porch, the same one where months ago she'd first realized her marriage was falling apart. The rain was light, the sky soft and gray. She thought about James, about how he had helped her rediscover parts of herself she thought were gone forever. But she also thought about what she'd almost lost: her integrity, her balance, her sense of right and wrong, in the quiet of that evening. She made a decision: she was going to try to rebuild her marriage. Not for obligation, but because she wanted peace. The next morning, she found Mark sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, surprised to see her dressed early. "Everything okay?" he asked. She hesitated, then said softly, "No, not really. But I want it to be." He put the phone down. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, "I've been lonely, Mark, for a long time. And I think you have too. We stopped seeing each other. We just became polite strangers." Mark looked uncomfortable, like a man suddenly seeing the truth of his own reflection. "I didn't realize it was that bad," he admitted quietly. "It was," she said honestly. "But I'm not blaming you. I just don't want to live like that anymore. If we can fix this, if there's still something left, I want to try." For the first time in years, Mark's eyes softened. He nodded slowly. "Maybe we both stopped trying," he said. The conversation was awkward but real. They didn't solve everything that morning, but it was the first honest talk they'd had in years. In the following weeks, Claire started making small changes. She began cooking again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to share moments. She suggested walks after dinner. Sometimes Mark said yes, sometimes no, but she didn't stop asking. At the same time, she missed therapy terribly. There were moments she almost picked up her phone to email James to thank him again, to ask how he was. But she never did. She knew reaching out would reopen feelings she was trying to let fade instead. She channeled that energy into herself, painting, writing, journaling like James had taught her. Her notebook filled with reflections about love, choices, regret, and rediscovery. She realized that what she had felt for James wasn't really about him. It was about what he represented: understanding, tension, warmth. Weeks turned into months. Her marriage didn't magically heal, but it softened. Mark started helping in small ways, setting the table, asking about her day. One evening, he brought home her favorite tea without being asked. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a spark. "Thank you," she said quietly. He smiled a little. "You've been different lately. Happier?" "Maybe I finally started remembering who I am," she said, later that night, as they sat on the porch together watching the sunset. Claire felt a strange peace settle inside her. She realized she didn't need anyone else to complete her. Not Mark, not James. She just needed to keep choosing herself every day. Months later, Claire passed by the same street where James's office was located. Out of habit, she slowed down. Through the window, she saw the familiar glow of the lamp and a new patient sitting in the waiting room. For a moment, she felt a pang of nostalgia, but also gratitude. That place had been where she'd broken down, but also where she'd begun to rebuild. She smiled softly, whispered a quiet thank you to the memory, and drove on. When she got home, Mark was in the garden fixing the small fence. He looked up and waved, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years: quiet contentment. Not the dizzying excitement of new affection, but something steadier, calmer, real. That night, as she wrote in her journal, she wrote a single line that summed up everything she'd learned. Sometimes the people who wake us up aren't meant to stay. They're just meant to remind us that we're still alive. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and felt at peace. The ache was gone. In its place was something better: acceptance. For the first time in years, she slept deeply, her heart light, her mind quiet, and in the morning, as the sun rose over the quiet street, Claire Evans smiled. Not because her life was perfect, but because she was finally living it again.